Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I hope that you are well and you've all enjoyed a nice bank holiday weekend and that the transition was easy for those of you who went back to school or further education this week. And for those of you who sent children back to school within the constraints of social distancing. From experiencing, there was a from my experience, there was a mixture of excitement and anxiety within our house, and I'm guessing it might have been similar for some of you. You are listening to Atiyah Ali on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show on Ramadan Radio Wolves, Wolverhampton online on ramadanradiowolves.com. In the previous show, our guest, Monica Shafak, the Chief Executive of the Kaleidoscope Plus Group, shared the mental health implications of racism and how services could improve access for people from minority ethnic communities, stressing an additional culturally sensitive focus on mental health and promoting access to mental health support. You can listen back to this on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further mental health information on my Twitter feed at Atiyah Ali 3. In the show today, we hope to provide information that may be helpful to support your well-being and the well-being of others, because everyone's mental health matters. We have a continued focus on mental health and emotional well-being, in particular exploring men's mental health and well-being during these challenging times and beyond. We won't be taking any live calls within the show. However, we welcome questions or comments via the WhatsApp messaging number on 07 440 420 432. You can message in with your name or anonymously on 07 440 420 432. And I will try my best to share your comments or questions. We won't be taking live calls within the show at all today, as mentioned. Our guest today is Dr. Abdullah Mia. He is a consultant clinical psychologist working in the NHS and in private practice at the Pebble Practice. He has a particular interest in psychological therapy for men and supporting ethnic minority communities, and has worked within these fields for the last 12 years. He currently supports a range of projects within the local community, whilst also supporting the development of services to be equitable across diverse characteristics. Welcome to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show, Dr. Abdullah Mia.
Assalamualaikum. Hello, thank you.
Wa alaikum salam. It's good to have you here. Firstly, can you tell us a little bit about your role as a psychologist and how you came into this work?
Yes, my route in was, when people usually ask me this, there's two reasons why I ended up in mental health services in that way. One is a personal view, and one is a professional development view. And they both contribute. So, for example, in my personal life, I've always been someone who has spoken with my friends, my family, around things that are going on for them. And I've been really curious as to why people do what they do. Within that as well, having a family experience of mental health difficulties really contributed to me understanding as to what makes my experience slightly different. At the time, I didn't know. In addition to that, there's something about professionally, I've always been interested in trying to help people, but to understand why people do what they do. So in the NHS, I work within a forensic mental health service. So before I used to be a youth offending officer, and I've worked in youth work as a teaching assistant. And I've always wanted to do a little bit more. In clinical psychology, following doing an undergraduate, interestingly not in psychology at all, but in neuroscience, I then became more and more curious as to how people think, what motivates their behaviour, what motivates the way they relate to other people. And as I progressed through my career, I become more and more, as an Indian Muslim male, I end up with a lot of male clients as well. And I've started to really think about what is it that stops men from accessing services,
Mm.
but also within that, the South Asian community in general, what prevents people. And I've had the luxury of being able to work with wonderful supervisors. Two of the most important people who supervise me really had a focus on making sure services were critical.
Right.
So
Mm.
that's my journey into how I became a psychologist, I suppose.
Brilliant. And I think having some personal experience also helps, doesn't it, with regards to the profession in terms of family experience?
I suppose the one thing that you really realise is mental health services really rely on diagnoses to get access, and from my experience, it's not necessarily needing a diagnosis to understand that there might be a lot of distress or trauma in someone's life.
Mm.
So thinking about why people's behaviour in my family may have changed over time based on some of the experiences that they may have had
Mm-hmm.
and what the consequences of that have been, I think that's really been crucial as to help me understand what prevents not just the South Asian community or minority ethnic communities, but what prevents a lot of people across the board,
Mm-hmm.
if they've had really traumatic experiences, access services for fear of being pathologized, being labelled, um,
Right.
and the team members, whatever diverse characteristics you might subscribe to.
Right. So,
Particularly challenging experiences.
mhm, mhm. How many men actually that you're aware of in your experience, or from perhaps statistics that you might be aware of, access mental health support? Do you think what contributes towards men accessing services, and how many men actually access services?
So I think one of the biggest things that we've got to recognise is um, suicide is one of the biggest causes of death for men under the age of 35.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the latest Office of National Statistics data,
Mm-hmm.
we know that 3 out of 4 completed suicides. That's 76% of the men, because 76% of suicides rather are committed by men. And we also know that around
76%.
12.5%,
Mm-hmm.
yes, of
Yeah.
76% of
Can't hear
suicides
you very
are by
clearly,
men.
Dr. Mia, sorry. I can't hear you very clearly. You might be cutting off a little bit, but if you could just repeat that statistic, sorry.
Yes, I think 76% of suicides are by men. And what we know is that men are 3 times more likely than women to become alcohol dependent or use substances. In addition to that, what we know is 1 in 8 men have some mental health problem.
Right,
So
so
that's the prevalence.
1 in 8 men have a mental health problem. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we talk about common mental health, we're talking about anxiety or depression, things that make us feel uncertain or make us feel low. However, what we also know is that diagnosis is far more underreported as well.
Mm-hmm. It's far more
It's underreported.
underreported, yeah. Apologies, I can't hear you
Yeah.
very clearly. Yeah.
I
So,
find, yeah.
so for men, it's underreported.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Continue, sorry.
The diagnoses are, I think some of the reasons for this, some of the reasons that contribute to this can be that men won't go to their GP.
Right.
But what we also know is when they do go that often, it's the first thing isn't thought to be around mental health difficulties,
Mm-hmm.
and those reasons, those discussions don't necessarily happen with the GP as fluently for
Right.
a number of reasons.
Mm-hmm. So when men go to the doctors to speak about their issues, they don't tend to talk about their emotional well-being. There's more of a physical conversation going on about physical health, sorry. Can you hear me, Dr. Mia?
Yes?
Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So when men tend to access their GP, excuse me, they tend to talk about physical health problems.
Yes, they'll talk about physical health problems, or they'll spend time talking about familial problems. So my thesis was in Indian and Pakistani men's understanding of emotional distress. And one of the things that we really found out in this research was around the idea that men were more likely to go to their family, and if not their family, their friends. And if both of those groups couldn't help them, outside of seeking support from family and friends, they'd rather not seek support at all. Or when they do, they tend to talk about things in a distanced way. So they talk about things in a way which they talk about it through their family members, so their family interaction, and rather than personalise.
Welcome back. You're listening to Atiyah Ali in conversation with Dr. Abdullah Mir, with a focus on men's mental health on Ramadan Radio Wolves. A reminder that we welcome your WhatsApp messages on 07440 420 432. And I will try my best to share your comments or questions. Okay, so before the break, in which we were quickly cut off, Dr. Mir, you were talking about your research, and it was very interesting. Please do continue.
Yes, so I was talking about the idea that my research around Indian and Pakistani men's understanding of emotional distress was it's very much dependent on what context people are in. So the first port of call that people will go to in these, that Indian Pakistani men will go to, will be their spouses, if they're married, or their family members. And then there's a hierarchy of who they will go to. The next people after that is more extended family members, and then after that, very close friends, and then community. Interestingly, at community, most men will stop at asking for help because of the belief that if all these people couldn't help me, no one else outside the community will be able to help me. So what you then get is a issue with regards to if you don't know what support is out there, you're not going to be able to access it. This is all under the guise of people's understanding of spirituality and religion. So whatever people might think about their spirituality and religion, if it's not incorporated into the support that's offered, more often than not, people start to pull away from that support. Within all of this as well, the most curious thing was that I found approaches like in cognitive behavior therapy, which you may have spoken about before, that thinks about how we think and feel about particular issues. That was one of the most effective ways in which people felt that they could address their problems.
Right.
So what we know is that if you can combine spirituality, cultural needs, and an effective form of CBT, that can work.
Okay. Now, in terms of speaking to family members, were community members finding that an easy thing to do? Because you said they spoke to their immediate family members and then extended before they even thought about going out, and whether they did depended on that. Did they find that easy to do in your research, or was that an area of focus?
No, they didn't find that easy to do. So what we know, this isn't just located in ethnic minority men, what we know is men have an idea of what it means to be a male, what it means to be a man. And more often than not, there is a subscription, there is an idea that you buy into, that as the man of the house, you need to be strong, you need to be powerful, you need to be the provider. The challenge with this is that whilst that is and can be a true and positive thing, it can also lead to experiences where people feel they need to protect their family members, so they can't disclose. So within my private practice, I get a lot of people coming up to me, talking to me about how they feel really challenged about talking to their partners and their family, because they don't want to worry them, they don't want to stress them out. So they feel burdened and on their own with this. And what part of therapy can really encourage is to be able to start to really think about how they can access support through their family, but also to be able to think about how just because you're talking about difficulties doesn't mean that there's a deficiency within yourself,
Yeah.
and that it's quite normal to experience mental health up and down within the course of one's life.
And you're right, men are often thinking about their role in the family, and within certain communities, they're often discouraged to express their emotions. For example, phrases like "don't cry like a girl" and "boys don't cry" and "man up." These kind of phrases are used, and there's a stigma for being kind of too sensitive. This might influence the decision to avoid being in touch with their feelings. Why is it important for men to be aware of their feelings?
I think that's a really good question. And you're right. So let me talk about the stigma for starters. One of the things about it, men are discouraged to talk about their emotions, and there's a growing body of people that are starting to promote this.
Okay.
However, the way in which men talk about their emotions is different, and the way in which they address things is different. So men are quite practical and behavioural. So what they do is, when they want to communicate care or love or anger, they will do it through behavioural means. So they'll shout, or if you try to show care for your partner, you might make them a cup of tea or something in a practical sense, or you might do some work around the house as a way of showing care, as opposed to using the language. The challenge with this is that sometimes what you intend to communicate and what is communicated is different. Within that, there's also something around how people understand communication. So if someone is trying to do something for you, whether that is seen as a supportive thing, the consequence of all of this is, if you are able to verbalize or connect with your feelings, they get pushed back into your mind. So whilst we spoke about CBT on one end, what we also know from a more what is classed as a psychodynamic understanding is, when we push things into the back of our minds, we can sometimes get really challenged by, they come out in other ways, and some of our behaviours in other ways. So sometimes, I don't know, an example might be, you might be really annoyed about something and you put it to the back of your mind, but then you go back home and your patience is a little bit shorter than normal, and you're not really sure why. And more often than not, it's because of something else which is unrelated, but it comes through in your behaviours in that current moment. So one of the reasons why it's really important to be about feelings is, if you don't know what's going on for you inside, your interactions with other people start to become a little bit more tense or pressured, which then increases our stress levels. And one of the consequences of increased stress levels, other than mental health difficulties in the long term, is also around the idea that we can also have quite physiological consequences. So what we know is, if we continually become stressed, our bodies can react adversely.
Yeah. Yeah. So your bodies can have a physical reaction, and do you think that it is this physical reaction that men might be able to notice more so?
I'm not sure about that one. What we know is, more often than not, people might hold tension in their bodies. So what we think about stress and anxiety might be held in one's back or one's shoulders or in headaches. And we know within certain communities that it's more likely to be communicated as a physical thing. So you might say that I have a headache, I have a tension headache, or things like that. But what might be feeding that tension headache is an actual stress,
Right.
or
So
psychological pressure, work pressure.
So some research suggests that men experience anxiety disorder less than women. However, psychologists are increasingly concerned that men are also experiencing anxiety, and that this is underreported, as you were saying earlier. Could you explain what anxiety is and what might cause anxiety? What do you think is the relationship to anxiety and early history? Is there a relationship? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So the first thing I want to say is, anxiety is generally quite normal. right? And anxiety is when we feel worried, tense, or afraid, right? When we think about something that is going to happen in the future, right? Or when we can't get those thoughts out of our minds. Now that's quite normal. However, sometimes um, our thoughts and our worries can increase to such an intensity that they don't match what's happening. Like an example might be, at this moment in time during coronavirus, about 3 to 4 months ago, and even now really when we're still seeing a little bit of an increase as well, um, it would be totally normal to feel anxious about going into public spaces where people might not be fully compliant with wearing masks or not.
Right.
However, that is a normal anxiety. That shouldn't be pathologized. What happens is, if we then become so worried about it that we refuse to leave our house, we don't, we try and avoid going shopping, we become quite worried about getting coronavirus and therefore we're constantly washing our hands or we're disinfecting everything in the house all the time and it takes up more time than anything. That is when we start to realise that actually it's become a problem. The idea that men experience anxiety disorders less than women, um, I'm not entirely sure about the statistics about that, but what I do know is I agree that it is underreported, and I spoke a little bit about that.
And the
One
reason?
of the things that can cause anxiety can often be things like um, what what we think is the norm, what we ought to do, and what we should do. So one of the things that might be really useful to think about is sometimes we can judge ourselves on how we think the community or society sees us or what we should be doing. But we don't really know for certain whether that is the case, but we assume it to be so. And those assumptions are built upon what we've experienced growing up. So how we've interacted with the community or how we've interacted with society, what we might read in the news, what we might feel on TV. All those experiences growing up help shape the way we see the world. One of the things that might be really important to think about is if you grow up in a world where everyone is saying men shouldn't speak about emotions, we internalize that message. We start to believe it too. That if you talk about your emotions, that means you're weak. So what you end up doing is you end up having to fight against what you think society is telling you and what you feel you need to do. And that conflict can cause anxiety within us as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So you're talking there about normal anxiety as well as anxiety that's kind of getting out of control, and it's taking over your life. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. So, like I said, and it's an individual thing. So I can't sit and say to someone that they have an anxiety problem if they're living their life in a totally acceptable way. So one of my friends has particular routines that he goes through, and other people have said, "Oh, I think he's got something called obsessive compulsive disorder." But the reality is, he doesn't. He lives a full life. He's able to play with his children. He's able to do things with his wife, and he's able to go and do things. And if we start to believe the narrative that is out there in the world that anything where there's some order is OCD, we then start to create more anxiety within ourselves. So it's really important to recognize whether a person is happy doing what they're doing, and if they are, that's okay.
Okay. Now, when it comes to mental health problems, some men might develop unhelpful coping strategies, and I think you touched upon that a bit earlier when you were talking about avoidance. So an example could be avoiding a party invite due to their experience of social anxiety, let's say. This sometimes moves people away from addressing the actual issue. What do you understand about some of the ways in which men try to cope with anxiety or depression or any form of mental health distress? Have you come across
That's
any
a really good question.
behaviours?
So what we know, and I'll speak for myself here as well, One of the things that's really enjoyable about going to the gym is that you can work out your stress.
Right.
And implicitly as well, what happens is you reinforce that narrative that you're building up your stress. However,
We're losing you a
when that
little bit. Sorry.
becomes a primary, when that becomes a primary way of coping, and you feel if you don't go to the gym, you're going to get more distressed, that's when we know it becomes unhelpful. That's a more nebulous kind of coping strategy. What we do know with men, particularly, is they're more likely to use substances.
Right.
So men will more likely use alcohol, or they'll use drugs, or they'll use both. And one of the reasons for that is it can distract us from what we're feeling. It can detach ourselves from our feelings. So what we do know is there is a very high use of substances to help cope with distress. It allows us to detach and separate from our feelings. However, the problem is with many drugs like cannabis and alcohol, they can act as depressants. So for the short term, they seem to work. In the long term, what happens is you start to feel more and more depressed. One of the consequences is as well that you can start to really feel that you're not good enough. You're not doing the right thing. So most people that I know who use non-helpful coping strategies, on some level also know that this isn't what they want to do, which reinforces their low mood.
Right. So these
Another unhelpful coping strategy that people can have is, and this is quite common, they can use aggression. So one thing I'm really conscious of is when people come to see me and they talk about where their distress is going. So I ask them, where does your distress go? And they recognise that they have a short fuse and they can punch walls or they can shout at friends and family. And that's when we really need to start thinking about the impact of domestic violence. Right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm really keen on is thinking about how men might try to rid of the feelings that they don't like inside themselves that make them think they're weak by exercising power and domination over another person.
So that would be adverse kind of reactions to their anxiety or distress would be lashing out at someone. Is that what you're suggesting that some people do?
Yes.
Okay.
So what we know is that people can then turn, but then these are people who will really dislike themselves for doing that as well.
Right. Right. So
Right.
Continue, sorry. Okay. So some men view physical health as very important, as you've just said. You're talking about kind of those coping strategies and people going to the gym and kind of getting rid of some of the stress. And it becomes a problem when they don't get rid of the stress, I'm hearing you say. Now, some men view physical health as very important. They look after the dietary needs, they increase exercise, and rightly so. However, there seems to be less focus on mental health. Men also seem to have increased pressure to be strong, as you mentioned earlier. And although strength may mean different things to different people, for some, refraining from sharing their feelings portrays as a sense of strength. How can we go about in terms of addressing this? And we do have a question from a listener, and we're welcoming questions on the show on 07440 420 432. And this question, the problem is that many men think therapy is nonsense and does not work. So we have two problems. They are in denial of their issues and they don't believe in the treatment and support. Abdullah, how would you react to this?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to address the question from the caller, the listener first, and then I'll come back to the other comment that you had made.
Thank you.
So you're right. Men that I've worked with have said, what's the point? What's the point of talking to you? That's not going to help the problem. But what not is, my job isn't necessarily to address the problem. My job as a psychologist is to help that person think in a different way outside of their own mind to come to a solution themselves. So one of the things that we know is people assume that therapy is come into my room, lie down on my couch and talk about your mother and father. That old school Freudian kind of thing. That is not what therapy is like at all whatsoever. And people need to get that out of their heads. When people come to see me for therapy, one of the biggest things is really having these challenging conversations. Having to think about why we do what we do and what we get from it and what we lose from it. And act like problem solvers together with another person. What we know is if we can lower our stress, anxiety and depression levels, we can make more functional and positive decisions. So that's how therapy can really help. It gives skills in which you can manage your emotional arousal, but it also allows you to test out thinking outside of your own mind and to really explore why we might be making the choices that we do.
Right. And
so with regard to why people address therapy, I think one of the things is addressing the stigma of what therapy is. And we can do that. So one of the projects I'm involved in is with the local mosques, we have drop-in sessions. And it's really positive to see that more and more community members are talking about what mental health distress is about and what therapy is about. Because I think when people talk about therapy, it's really interesting. More often than not, men will see it as a female trait or a feminine trait, I should say, about talking, whereas they want to be doing. And this comes back to what your question was around physical health prioritizing over psychological mental health. The challenge here is not to separate the two. So there have been times where I've done therapy with men walking around the park. Because one of the things is doing something active whilst we're talking can really help men relax and really start to think a little bit more about what's going on for them. Alongside that, in my private practice, I have a colleague who also works with people through the gym to try and get them to think about what's happening as they're doing exercise.
Yeah. And so what are the benefits of accessing early mental health support? Well, seeking support as soon as we realise there's a problem. I mean, how can families support this?
Right, okay. So in terms of accessing mental health support early, the biggest advantage is, A, you're less likely to be ending up on medication. B, you are less likely to have more severe long term. What we know is the faster you address the problem, the shorter the recovery time is, more often than not. However, if you have more longer term issues, so sometimes issues might not just be around anxiety or depression. There might be about the way we might relate to other people. And in doing so, that difficulty relating to other people is often based on how people have been raised and the experiences they've had at the hands of people. Now, those kinds of difficulties that we have might need longer term issues. Within all of this, we need to take into account things like bullying and this abuse and oppression from other groups. The advantage of accessing early mental health support with regard to this, or having a space to talk, is it keeps our general level of anxiety and depression in a way that we can manage. So rather than using anxiety and depression, if I was to say everybody has everyday worries and stresses, everybody will have times when they feel low or upset about something. If we can have someone who can talk about that, what generally happens is we can keep that level quite low. If we start to bottle up, that's when issues become more permanent and rigid, and our ways of thinking become more fixed. So if somebody wants to use a really nice analogy with me, that it's a bit like a river. So as the river keeps on going along its route, it gets more and more deeper into the ground. And to generate an alternative river path, you need to do a lot of hard work
Mhm.
So what therapy does is help you generate another track by which the river can move. But it is hard work.
Absolutely. So a lot of time and effort is needed, but in the end, you can find your path, right? Are you there?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that. Yes.
Yeah, you can't hear me. Okay, let's go on to the next subject. I wanted to talk a little bit about young men and what about young men? Do mental health problems differ for them? Can they seek support from their schools, colleges, universities, or workplaces too? I mean, what can family members or friends do to encourage the discussion of mental health?
Right. So young men in particular. So I think there's a lot. Currently, the government is funding a lot. They put a lot more money
Hmm.
into mental health services for children and young people. Um, the advantage of that is um, young men have got multiple arenas now in which they experience life. So, for example, one of the new things that are coming through is the impact of gaming and the social platform that we have.
Hmm.
What we get is within schools and within youth clubs, education, a lot more people who are more fluent in being able to talk about the stress and pressures of young people. So I'm not entirely sure that there's a huge distinction to be made between young men
Hmm.
and young women.
Hmm.
But what I will say is what we know is that there's a growing body of research and practice being changed where schools are becoming more trauma informed
Right.
and becoming more acceptable of thinking about what people's experiences are in school, how social inequality and deprivation might impact upon people.
Hmm.
So one of the things within school is often the idea of the impact social media and seeing what other people have and do not have has on one's well-being. Once again, it becomes a thing of comparisons between oneself and the other.
Hmm.
So what schools can start to do is, and they have started, people who are working within social, emotional, and behavioural needs. There are people who practice emotional well-being and pastoral care within schools, but also within youth clubs. I remember when I used to be a youth worker, we used to have youth workers used to be brilliant at just taking the young person aside and being able to have a quick chat with them without it becoming too formal.
Yeah. Yeah. So, schools and places of education have things in place, youth clubs, etc., have things in place for young men in terms of supporting their well-being and creating awareness of mental health issues that sometimes do start earlier on in life. Um,
Yes.
Abdullah, yeah. So, over the years, there's been an increased negative portrayal of men from minority ethnic communities within the media and with added negative attention for Muslim men, and this might lead to stigma, Islamophobia, etc., resulting in discrimination. Are you aware of mental health problems that may be linked to this?
So yes, what we know is the ongoing discrimination, racial and cultural discrimination around, particularly around Muslim men, does. So if I break it down, what happens is you have a threat system.
Mhm.
And if you walk around the streets constantly with that threat system activated, what will happen is you're going to cause yourself a lot of psychological distress. If you're constantly watching out for whether someone is going to pull you over for a stop and search, or if you're going to be thinking about the idea that other people are judging you because they fear you might be a terrorist, because this is what is being portrayed within the media, what will happen is not only will you start to get a growing resentment for the idea that you're judged unfairly, but you also become quite fearful of repercussions. What we know is that this can result in people becoming really conscious of who they are. So what we also know is sometimes what this can result in is that there can be a flip into, like I spoke to you earlier, to get rid of these feelings of distress and aggression within oneself, to then act them out. So people will either act them out or they might be more likely to use substances. Because one of the things that we know about the negative portrayal of Muslim men is people will then start to think we're all group animals. So within this what we tend to do is we tend to stick with cultures which connect with ourselves. So what young do is they might start to find a culture which fits with them. And more often than not, that can sometimes revolve camaraderie around people who have had shared experiences. So other young men with young men, but what you then get is a bubbling pot for people who are distressed and angry. And as some people might internalize that, and some people might externalize it. By internalizing it, you might become quite low and scared. By externalizing it, what you might end up doing is becoming more aggressive, which feeds into that narrative as well.
So there are some mental health issues that might arise from the negative portraying of Muslim men, and therefore it's really important for those men then to access services at an earlier stage. How would you reassure?
Yes, what I wanted to say. Sorry, I was just going to say.
No, no problem.
I think one of the biggest things is that it's not necessarily about accessing mental health services per se.
Right.
I think what we would be better off doing is making sure our communities, our youth clubs and our schools, the normal processes where people go and collect and sit together, those places are more comforting and supportive as opposed to being dismissing or invalidating of one's experience.
So expertise or training within those organisations as well in terms of supporting individuals that approach them, I'm guessing. How would you reassure men who are aware that they might be experiencing a mental health issue or problem but may be worried about taking the next step for seeking support? So let's say their worries about confidentiality and sharing their experiences. What would you say to them? How would you reassure them?
This is a very common problem. This is a very common problem and a perception that happens within many communities. One of the issues is around the idea that people worry. It's the thinking that the communities will talk. However, what we know is more often than not, the GPs that families go to, they have a central person who everyone talks to. But all the GPs, all your mental health professionals, all your health professionals are bound by confidentiality. They would never share those issues with other people. So that would break professional code of conduct. Therefore, what often the case of it is, I will hear things from different people, but it's my responsibility as a mental health professional to hold on to that as confidential information and not to share that, not even with my family or with anyone else. Unless there is a risk of harm to somebody else or other people. So I think one of the biggest things is trying to think about the idea that there's a legal responsibility of mental health professionals and health professionals in general to maintain confidentiality. The only time that is broken is when we consider it to be a threat to themselves or to other people. And usually when that's the case, I have a conversation with these people. So for example, if we were talking about the idea of let's say domestic violence or sexual abuse, that would be something that we would be legally obligated to disclose. However, if we're talking about something around the idea of two distressing experiences that a person has had and we don't have any information, we wouldn't share that information with the wider community.
Right. Thank you. I hope that provides some reassurance to our listeners. Abdullah, just to let you know that we are nearing the end of our time to discuss this important topic. But before we do end, there is a question from a listener, and I wanted to find out a little bit more about what services you might recommend for men. If we quickly go to the question that the listener has sent in, they're saying that it's really good that mental health is being highlighted, especially for men from ethnic minority backgrounds. I think that parents should be more supportive and change their mindset with respect to stereotypical views on how men should be. Is there any advice or tips the guest could provide for parents?
So could you repeat that last bit again?
Yeah, is
You
there
broke
any?
up for a second, sorry.
It's okay. Is there any advice or tips, guess, that you could provide for parents? Is there any advice or tips in
Yes.
terms of encouraging focus on mental health?
I think one of the things that's really important is people assume that mental health difficulties is something which is relatively new. However, what we know is that this has been written about since the philosophers of. So what we know is people like Avicenna, or within the Islamic world is known as Ibn Sina, was also someone who communicated around psychological issues with Descartes. They wrote letters to each other. So this is something which has been within the Islamic world, but also in the general world for quite a long time. Within the UK, we tend to talk about the idea that actually mental health is just from within the Western world, but it's been spoken about across the world. With regards to parents, one of the biggest things is that parents assume that this is a very new thing. And the other thing that parents tend to assume is that as long as you work hard, you'll get through it. So it's really important for parents to also realise that sometimes it's not necessarily about working hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes about acknowledging that this distress is quite relevant. A lot of parents, and what we know because of the nuclear family that operates within many ethnic minority communities, but also within working class communities as well, what we know is that it's really important to get the parents on board. So if you are struggling with something, be able to talk about that with your parents. But if not, ask your GP if you could have a joint session with your parents, or ask your mental health professional. It's really important to get parents on board. There are various sites that I would recommend for parents and for people. So Mind is a really great site where we can start thinking about mental health. And it has various translated material for people who don't speak English. Within that, parents also need to acknowledge that the world in which we live now is different to the one that was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and more. So there are different pressures.
Right.
And the way one may have coped with, say, racism in the 70s and the 60s would not be the same as one copes with racism now. And racism might be more subtle, or there might be different pressures around the idea of academic attainment.
What services would you recommend for men wanting to access mental health? We've got around a minute to answer. Sorry, Abdullah. Around a minute to answer. You have around a minute to answer. It's just, what services would you recommend for men wanting to access mental health? What services?
So I think that there's two. One is there's a lot of online resources and support systems out there for people at the moment. So you can look at Men's Minds Matter, Men's Health Forum. I'd also want to do a shout out to, there's a wonderful organisation called the Lions Barber Collective, which trains up barbers to be more mentally health aware around how to work with people. So there's three main: Men's Health Forum, Men's Minds Matter, and generally what I'd also say is look into the things that are happening around sports. So there's a lot of access around sports and mental health, so rugby and football. There's a lot of high-profile sports stars that are now talking about the mental health distress that they've experienced. This being all said, what I would also recommend is you don't necessarily need to have men's-only services. There are a lot of services that are really competent at being able to address within the NHS, being able to address the idea of what mental health experiences men are having.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Sorry, we are reaching the end of the show. And there's also the Pebble. What is your organisation called?
The Pebble Practice.
The Pebble Practice.
Yeah, the Pebble Practice.
Thank you for joining us in the show today and giving up your time. In particular, I like that you said that people need to have a space to talk, and you're looking at dynamic approaches to therapy, literally a walk in the park. I hope to join you guys, or the listeners, on the 3rd of October with my guest, Myra Khan. You can listen back to this show on Ramadan